everyone, and thank you for joining us for this final installment of the PHUSE video series, Open Source Technologies in Clinical Data Analytics. My name is Michael Rimler, and I am the Open Source Technologies Director at PHUSE. Joining us today is Caroline Phares, Vice President and Head of Life Sciences at Domino Data Lab, where she's been building the life sciences vertical since April of 2022. Prior to Domino, she spent 20 years at GSK as a business partner and technology leader in designing, delivering, and supporting innovative solutions across R&D. Caroline is a thought leader, an active listener, and a problem solver, and an avid runner. And it is my great pleasure to welcome Caroline to this installment of the PHUSE video series. Welcome, Caroline.
Thank you so much, Michael. I'm so excited to be here.
So I'm just going to jump right in, and I've asked this question to each of our video series experts. As a leader in this space, tell me a bit about the why for open source for you. What do you see as the value of open source in pharma, and why should we care?
When I think personally, for me, I'm someone who really advocates for collaboration. I think with collaborative efforts, things move much more quickly. I think people who are collaborating on something are usually driven or motivated by something very intrinsic, and they bring their passion to the work. And I think open source pretty much embodies that in technology. So I come from a software engineering background, and open source has been around for a pretty long time in software engineering. And I remember using it, applying it. And then a few years ago, it really started to grow in the statistics space. When R came about, open source being used for statistical programming started to become more popular. And now it's become very important in the pharmaceutical industry, especially in statistical programming for studies. So why is it important? When you look at open source and then you think of the standard ways of working, we standardize a lot, right? In humans, humans standardize a lot. What is the big example for this is like the metric system and the ways we measure things. That's a standard. Those are standards. The reason we standardize is it's for efficiency. It's for efficiency in communication, and also so that we don't lose knowledge that we compound on what we already have. So when we think of standards, and then we think of open source, in my opinion, it's like work and standardization, code and standardization are really coming together. We have done a lot of standardizing in the pharmaceutical space, especially in clinical trials. And as you know, with CDISC, with Transcelerate, we've tried to come together, collaborate, and standardize on a lot. And then open source is here, I think, to facilitate and to really put that standardization into practice, so that we can get as much out of it, in as much efficiency out of it as possible. So that's why I think open source is really important right now in pharmaceutical work.
Great, thanks. And at the September Webinar Wednesday, we discussed a bit about your Open SCE initiative that you've started. For those that may have missed that Webinar Wednesday, can you tell us a bit about why this initiative is important and why you're so passionate about it?
So this was an idea that I had, and I'm actually doing a presentation on this at PHUSE EU in November. So this is an idea that I had that really started with that SCE white paper that came out in 2021. But I remember in 2019 when a lot of people were working on it across the industry, so many people across the industry coming together to define a common set of requirements for a modern statistical computing environment. That's just another really great example of collaboration and standardization. And if you have this list of requirements, then we're expecting somebody to implement it, right? Well, why would we put together a list of requirements if we weren't expecting somebody or some entity to be inspired to implement those requirements? The other thing that inspired me to have this kind of idea is I was leading the space program at GSK, which was one of the things that we were doing, was implementing a modern statistical computing environment. And we did a market scan and we looked at various different vendors, and it was really well acknowledged, actually acknowledged in that SCE white paper, that there is not one off-the-shelf statistical computing environment that actually meets 100% of the requirements in that white paper. There's always, like most companies at the time, were building their own solutions. Now, this is what occurred to me, right? If everybody's building their own solution, but we have a common set of requirements, and we have open source, like the concept of open source, and open source software has been around for quite a while, what really is stopping us from really achieving 100% of those requirements through open source? So that's how it started for me.
I don't want you to pull the curtain back before your presentation at FHUSE, so people might have to come to that presentation or view it afterwards to see more of the details. But let's I guess one thing that strikes me is just to maybe generalize a bit. What are some of the gaps that you see in existing SE solutions? You mentioned that there doesn't seem to be a commercial solution that meets all those requirements. What are some of the gaps? Just a couple of examples of things that you do see in what's currently available that you're trying to close.
So there's a couple of gaps. There's different types of SCE solutions that have been out there, right? There's ones that are really built around a process, or even with modules that were built around a specific process. So it's more workflow, user experience oriented, that meet a specific need. And often with those user experience oriented solutions, they are restrictive to be used only for a particular workflow or that particular workflow. So they were, in my experience, they were somewhat restrictive and we couldn't really flex that much. Then there are other solutions. You have to build basically on, you use the operating system and you use like technology underneath that provides certain foundation. But then what you don't get is that if you have to build your workflow on top of that, you don't get the same level of user experience focus as you would for those, some of those the software that's out there that really focuses on that user experience. You have more flexibility, but what you lack is the user experience. And so for me, it's the user experience, it's the workflow, because what we really want out of a modern SCE is the flexibility and the future readiness, the ability to grow and flex. But a lot of times what is lacking is that usability, so is that user experience, the specific UI that helps users to do their jobs in a more pleasant way. And so a lot of what I'm seeing as far as opportunity for open source to come in and help has to do with user experience and user interface to potentially back-end solutions.
So if I'm going to try and summarize this, do you think it's fair, tell me if I'm wrong about this, that the current solutions that exist are either if they're homegrown, then those organizations are solving their problems as they see them, and if they are a product that's by a third party that might be offered to them, then they're solving the problem as they sort of understand it. But all of these are done sort of in isolation in their own silos. And the nature of open source allows people to come together to share their problems and try and solve them where the solution actually meets everybody's requirements or as close to everybody's as possible. So I want to pull this just a bit back to your work at Domino, because I know that you said to me before the interview that the Open SCE is like, this is your project. This is something you're trying to drive with others in the industry. It's not just you alone, but this is the idea that you had. So how does this work differ from your role at Domino?
So I want to acknowledge Domino for supporting me and really sponsoring the launch of this, sponsoring the foundation of the Open SCE. I also want to acknowledge that Domino itself, as a very flexible platform, was my canvas initially for my ideas. So there were engineers and data scientists at Domino who could very easily contribute initially with open source tools that could integrate with Domino's API to make the Domino experience a little bit easier. So Domino is absolutely tied to the birth of this open source community, but it was very quickly opened up to others who wanted to contribute what they felt were useful tools. And so I do have, I mean, there are other contributors. There are at least 2 other entities that have contributed to, that have projects within the OpenSCE organization. And they're not Domino. Domino has sponsored the start of this open source community, but it is absolutely open to anyone who wants to contribute and to help in administering or organizing it, or even have a say or voice in it. I mean, we have a charter that we follow right now, but it really is a true open source community. And every project that is accepted into that community, it needs to be open as well, and it has to follow the same license, which is, I think, GPL 3v3.
And then, yeah, you have a GitHub repo for this, and we'll put it in the description of the video when it's posted out there. I have one last question on the OpenSCE project, if I may, and that is just to try and understand how you envision this project integrating with other initiatives that we're seeing, which are, of course, primarily in the R space, but things such as Pharmaverse or the CDISC Open Source Alliance and other things.
I absolutely, in my vision, I see there being integrations, or whether it's within processes or even technical solution integrations between all of those other open source communities that are out there, or initiatives or projects. I mean, I'm thinking already there's opportunities with Open Study Builder, and absolutely everything that's being done within Pharmaverse, with Admiral. I mean, those things can be weaved together. I mean, it's almost like these different projects have a specific purpose, and there is no overlap with what OpenSCE is doing. In fact, I think there's a lot of ways that all of these different open source solutions can work together in order to achieve a really great end-to-end efficient user experience.
I don't want to get into the details around validation, but that's always going to be a question that people look at. It'll be interesting to see, for example, some of the working groups going on with the R consortium and their interactions with regulatory and the pilot submissions that they've done. How might they might leverage that type of work with what's happening in the OpenSCE project to potentially get some of those questions answered as well. So stay tuned, everyone, and do pay attention to what's happening at PHUSE EU when Caroline gives that presentation. So speaking of which, you're also going to be joining us at PHUSE EU Connect for a special panel discussion on open source technologies. I think it's on the Tuesday of the conference. My last question to you is if you could impress one message on our audience with respect to open source technology and clinical research, what would that be?
I think what I would say to the audience, if there's anyone in the audience who is nervous about participating or contributing to open source, that the open source community is quite welcoming, at least the OpenSCE, and I'm sure others are. And I think collectively we're a bunch who are not only just stepping out of our comfort zone in order to get, what we're doing is more visible work than if you were working for a very specific company. I mean, this is very visible. I would say get involved, get over that fear if you have it, and get involved and contribute in whatever way you can. You can contribute by documentation, through ideas, through helping to manage the framework of the community itself. It doesn't necessarily have to be through code itself, but being involved in such a collaborative effort really actually feels very good. It's very different from just doing a job to get paid for a job. The motivation is different and is actually very fulfilling.
Thank you. Thank you. That's the last question that I actually had for you. So I want to thank you for your time today, Caroline. It's always a pleasure to talk with you. I hope everyone's found this PHUSE 5-part series on open source technologies and clinical data analytics to be valuable and thought-provoking. Thank you, everyone that's been involved. And if we don't see you in Birmingham, there's always Bethesda in February. Thanks for joining us, everyone.
Happy Halloween! Cowabunga!
Cowabunga!